My girlfriend always kept her distance when I wanted to get closer, but once I cooled off, she suddenly started showing interest. The usual female drama. Hey Reddit, my name is Maya, and I'm 26 years old. I've finally reached that point in life where I feel like I actually have my shit together. I work at a medical center doing coordination stuff, which basically means I'm the person who keeps all the different departments from completely falling apart and descending into chaos. It's demanding work, but I'm good at it, and it pays well enough that I can afford my own apartment. I love having my own place and my own routine. There's something incredibly freeing about being able to do whatever I want on weekends without having to check with anyone about anything. I can sleep in until noon, binge watch Netflix shows, go out with friends, or just stay home in my pajamas all day if that's what I feel like doing. That kind of independence is something I've worked hard for and definitely don't take for granted. Last summer, I was at my friend Jessica's pool party when I spotted this guy Derek standing by the drink cooler. He was having what looked like a pretty serious conversation with some other guy about work-related stuff. Even from across the pool area, I could tell right away that he was one of those solid, dependable types. You know the kind I'm talking about. The type of guy who probably has a steady job, owns his own place, definitely remembers birthdays, and shows up exactly on time for everything. Perfect boyfriend material, if you actually wanted a boyfriend. Which honestly, I wasn't entirely sure I did at the time. I mean, why would I want to mess up the good thing I had going for myself? The last thing I needed was to get tangled up with someone who would probably want to know where I was every night, and start talking about moving in together after just 3 months of dating. No thanks, I thought to myself. I'd seen too many of my friends lose themselves in relationships like that. But here's the thing about guys like Derek. They're really good at making you feel special without being pushy about it. When Jessica finally introduced us later that evening, he didn't do that weird aggressive flirting thing that so many guys resort to at parties. Instead, he just talked to me like I was a normal person, which was honestly refreshing. He asked thoughtful questions about my work and seemed genuinely interested when I told him about this absolute nightmare situation I dealt with recently. I explained how there had been this massive patient scheduling mix-up that almost caused a serious problem at the medical center. Different departments had been given conflicting information, and I'd had to spend an entire day calling everyone involved to sort out the mess before it turned into a legitimate crisis. When I told Derek the story, he actually laughed at the funny parts. Not in that fake way guys do when they're just trying to get in your pants, but like he genuinely thought I was entertaining and had a good sense of humor about the chaos of my job. Okay, I'll admit it. He was definitely cute. Not like model hot or anything dramatic like that, but he had this really nice smile that made his whole face light up. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, which I've always found incredibly attractive in a guy. When he handed me a soda from the cooler during our conversation, our fingers touched for just a second, and I felt that little spark thing that honestly doesn't happen very often. It was one of those moments where you're suddenly very aware of someone's physical presence. So when Derek asked for my number before I left the party that night, I gave it to him without hesitation. Even as I was typing my digits into his phone, though, I was already mentally calculating how I'd manage this new development with everything else I had going on in my dating life. Because here's what I learned a long time ago through trial and error. You never put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to dating, especially in today's world. I'd been talking to this guy Tyler on Bumble for a few weeks at that point. Nothing too serious or intense, but we'd been having decent conversations and seemed to have some things in common. There was also this other guy, Brandon, who I'd matched with on Hinge recently, and he seemed pretty promising based on our initial exchanges. I wasn't planning to date all of them at the same time or anything crazy like that. I'm not trying to juggle multiple serious relationships. But why should I delete my dating apps and cut off all my other options just because one guy asked for my number at a party? That's just not how smart women operate in today's dating landscape, at least not in my experience. So when Derek texted me 2 days later, asking if I wanted to grab dinner that weekend, I said yes without thinking twice about it. But I also kept my Tuesday night coffee date with Tyler that I'd already scheduled. And I definitely didn't delete my dating profiles either. I mean, Derek seemed nice and all, but I barely knew him at that point. I'd been burned before by guys who seemed absolutely perfect in the beginning, then turned out to be total disasters once you actually got to know them better and saw their true colors. Our first date was actually really good, though. Derek picked this nice Mexican restaurant. Nothing too fancy or pretentious, but definitely not some dive bar either. It struck the perfect balance for a first date. We ended up talking for like 3 hours straight about everything you can imagine. Work stories, travel experiences we'd had, family dynamics, all those getting to know you topics. You know how that whole dance either goes really well and flows naturally, or crashes and burns spectacularly with awkward silences. With Derek, it went really well. The conversation never felt forced or like we were running out of things to say. He was funny without trying too hard to be the entertainment for the evening, which I appreciated. Derek asked thoughtful questions about things I'd mentioned and didn't spend the entire time just talking about himself like so many guys tend to do on first dates. When he walked me to my car afterward at the end of the night, he gave me this perfect goodnight kiss. It wasn't too aggressive or presumptuous, but it also wasn't like he was treating me like his sister either. It was just right. The kind of kiss that leaves you thinking about it later when you're lying in bed. I definitely liked Derek after that first date, I'm not going to lie about that. But I also really liked having options and the security that came with them. I liked knowing that if things didn't work out with him for whatever reason, I wasn't going to be sitting home alone on Saturday nights feeling sorry for myself and wondering what went wrong. Having backup plans gave me confidence and kept me from getting too invested too quickly. The thing is, I'd gotten really good at managing multiple guys without any of them feeling like they were being played or strung along. It's all about calibration and understanding how much attention to give each person. You give each guy just enough interest and attention to keep them engaged and interested, but not so much that they start thinking they're your only option or that you're completely available to them whenever they want. With Derek specifically, I had developed a pretty deliberate approach. I'd wait a day or two before responding to his texts, even if I saw them right away and wanted to reply immediately. I kept our actual dates to once or maybe twice a week maximum, no matter how much I might have enjoyed spending time with him. I always made sure to maintain that little bit of mystery about what I was doing the rest of the time when we weren't together. I want to be clear. I wasn't doing this because I was trying to be manipulative or play mind games or anything malicious like that. It's just that I'd learned from experience that the minute you become too available to a guy, they tend to lose interest anyway. It's like some weird psychological thing where people value what seems scarce or hard to get. So yeah, I knew exactly what I was doing with this whole strategy. The main question in my mind was whether Derek would figure out what I was up to before I was ready to let him in on it. Around this time, Derek started sharing his perspective, and honestly, it was pretty different from mine. He told me later that the first month with me had felt pretty solid to him. He appreciated that I was smart and funny, and that I clearly had my shit together with my job at the medical center. He especially liked that I wasn't one of those clingy types who starts planning your weekends together after just the second date, which apparently had been an issue for him with other women he'd dated recently. Actually, he said I was almost the complete opposite of clingy. Sometimes he'd text me and not hear back for a day or two, which he found kind of refreshing after dating women who wanted to know what he was doing every 5 minutes of every day. But here's where things started to get complicated, and I had no idea this was happening at the time. Derek worked in equipment inspection, and apparently that job had made him really good at spotting patterns and noticing when something wasn't quite operating the way it should be. After about 6 weeks of US dating, he started noticing some patterns in my behavior that didn't completely add up in his mind. He began to see inconsistencies that made him question what was really going on. Derek noticed how I'd be super into him when we were actually together, laughing at his jokes, seeming genuinely interested in whatever he had to say, being physically affectionate and engaged. But then I'd go completely radio silent for 2 or 3 days afterward, like I'd just vanished into thin air. He also picked up on how I'd never make plans more than a few days in advance, always saying I needed to check my schedule first or see what was going on at work before I could commit to anything. He understood that people get busy, especially someone working in medical center coordination, where everything's constantly on fire and you're dealing with emergencies. But he started to distinguish between actually being busy and being deliberately evasive, and I was beginning to feel more like the second category to him. I would dodge his questions about my weekend plans with these super vague answers about maybe hanging out with friends or catching up on errands around the apartment. The thing that really got to him was how whenever he'd bring up anything that sounded remotely like future planning, even something as casual as mentioning a concert that was happening next month that he thought we might enjoy, I'd change the subject so fast it was like I had some kind of allergic reaction to the word future. He said it felt like dating two completely different people sometimes. The weirdest part for Derek was the contrast between how I acted when we were physically together versus how I communicated over text. In person, I'd be all over him, holding his hand, laughing at everything he said, acting like I was totally into whatever we had going on between us. But then he wouldn't hear from me for days at a time. And when he finally did get a text from me, it would be kind of distant and detached. Friendly enough, but not flirty. Interested, but not really invested in a meaningful way. He described it as feeling like he was dating two entirely different versions of the same person. So around the 2-month mark, Derek started doing what he apparently does at work when some piece of equipment isn't operating the way it's supposed to. Instead of trying to immediately fix whatever was wrong, he stepped back and observed the situation more objectively. Rather than always being the one to text me first, he decided to wait and see if I'd reach out on my own initiative. Instead of constantly being the person to suggest plans and activities, he let me take the lead sometimes to see what would happen. And you know what happened when Derek stepped back and stopped being the one to always initiate? Our communication dropped off by like 70% almost immediately. Suddenly we were seeing each other maybe once a week instead of our usual twice, and the whole dynamic between us shifted in a way that was pretty noticeable. Derek was 31 years old at this point, and he wasn't looking to play games with someone or get caught up in unnecessary drama. He had a good job that he actually enjoyed, his own place that he was proud of, a solid group of friends and hobbies that genuinely interested him. He wasn't desperate for female attention by any means, and he definitely wasn't interested in chasing after someone who couldn't be bothered to show even basic enthusiasm about spending time with him. His philosophy was pretty straightforward. Why would he waste his energy trying to convince someone to want to be with him when there were plenty of other women out there who would actually appreciate what he brought to the table? It seemed like a waste of time and emotional energy to pursue someone who was treating him like he was dispensable. So Derek started pulling back even more deliberately. When I'd text him, he'd still respond, but he stopped being the one to initiate conversations entirely. When I'd suggest hanging out, he'd say yes if he happened to be free, but he stopped rearranging his schedule to accommodate my availability the way he had been doing before. He started making plans with his friends again instead of always keeping his weekends open in case I wanted to do something together. Basically, Derek stopped treating me like a priority when it became clear that I was treating him like just another option among many. By the time we hit month 4 of whatever we were doing, he was pretty much done with the whole situation. He just needed to figure out how to end things without it turning into some big dramatic scene or causing unnecessary conflict. Meanwhile, I started noticing around month 3 that Derek was acting completely different, and honestly, it was throwing me off my game in a way I wasn't used to experiencing. He used to text me good morning pretty regularly, but suddenly I'd go 2 or 3 days without hearing from him at all. Not that I was actively keeping track or anything like that, but when you get used to a certain rhythm and pattern of communication with someone, you definitely notice when it changes significantly. And here's the weird thing about human psychology. Derek's sudden distance was making me way more interested in him than I'd been before. I know that sounds completely messed up, but there's something about a guy who stops chasing you that makes you start wondering what he's thinking about, what he's doing with his time, and who else he might be talking to instead of you. Before, when Derek was always available and always the one texting first, I kind of took that attention for granted. It was nice to have, but it didn't feel particularly special or rare. But now that he wasn't doing that anymore, I found myself checking my phone way more often than I wanted to admit, hoping to see his name pop up on my screen. The really frustrating part was that I was still talking to Tyler and Brandon, still keeping my options open like I always did with dating. But suddenly, both of them seemed incredibly boring compared to Derek. Tyler would send me these long, detailed texts about his day or some podcast he'd listened to that he thought I might find interesting, and I'd just be sitting there thinking, okay, cool story, bro. Brandon was always trying to make concrete plans for the weekend, being all eager and available whenever I had free time. What used to seem like positive qualities in a guy was starting to feel kind of desperate and clingy to me. Why couldn't either of them play it cool the way Derek was suddenly doing? It's completely crazy, right? Because just a few months earlier, I would have been totally into a guy who was straightforward about wanting to see me and didn't play games or make me guess what he was thinking. But now I was comparing everyone to this guy who was acting like he could take me or leave me, and somehow that had become the most attractive thing ever. What is wrong with women that we always seem to want what we can't have? So I started trying harder with Derek, which was definitely not something I was used to doing in my dating life. I'd be the one to text him first sometimes. I'd suggest specific plans for us to hang out, and I'd be extra flirty when we were actually together. And it was kind of working, I guess. He'd respond to my messages, and he'd make plans with me when I asked. But something fundamental had shifted between us. He seemed less emotionally invested somehow, like he was going through the motions of dating me, but his heart wasn't really in it anymore. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit to myself. Because somewhere along the way, without really meaning to, or even realizing it was happening, I'd started actually caring about this guy. Not just enjoying his company or liking the attention he gave me, but genuinely caring about what he thought of me, what he was doing when we weren't together, and whether he was thinking about me the way I was starting to think about him all the time. But here's the problem with my whole situation. I still couldn't bring myself to have that conversation, you know? The one where you sit down with someone and say, "Hey, what are we doing here? Do you want to be exclusive? Where do you see this relationship going?" Every single time I thought about bringing up that topic with Derek, I'd get this panicky feeling in my chest, like once we put official labels on whatever we had and made it a real relationship, everything would inevitably change and probably fall apart completely. At least the way things were. If everything went wrong between us, I could tell myself it wasn't that serious anyway. I could pretend like I hadn't really invested that much emotionally and just move on to someone else. But having an actual relationship conversation would make it real and meaningful, and that felt terrifying to me for reasons I couldn't fully explain. So instead of being honest about what I was actually feeling, I just tried desperately to get back to where we were before, back when Derek was more into me, and I felt like I had all the control in the situation. I'd suggest that we spend more time together on weekends, I'd be more physically affectionate when we were hanging out, and I'd try to recreate those early dates when everything felt easy and fun and uncomplicated between us. But you can't really go backwards once things have fundamentally shifted in a relationship, can you? And the harder I tried to make Derek interested in me again, the more I could actually feel him pulling away from me emotionally. It was like watching something precious slip through your fingers in slow motion. The tighter you try to hold onto it, the faster it disappears. And the absolute worst part was knowing deep down that I was the one who had caused this whole mess in the first place with my commitment issues and fear of vulnerability. So here's how the whole thing finally went down. After 6 months of this exhausting back and forth bullshit, Derek finally hit his absolute limit. It wasn't because of some big dramatic moment or explosive argument or anything like that. He just woke up one Saturday morning and realized he was completely tired of wasting his time with someone who clearly didn't want the same things he wanted from a relationship. And honestly, Derek's perspective was that life's too short to spend it trying to decode mixed signals from someone who's almost 30 years old and should know how to communicate like a functioning adult. He'd been thinking about ending things for weeks, really, turning it over in his mind every time we'd hang out. He'd watch me during our dates and wonder what the hell I was actually getting out of this arrangement we had going on, because it sure wasn't a real relationship in any meaningful sense of the word. We'd see each other once a week, maybe twice if schedules aligned perfectly. We'd have a good time together, sleep together sometimes, and then I'd disappear back into whatever mysterious life I had when he wasn't around. And anytime things started feeling too real or too serious between us, I'd find some way to dial it back down to casual and non-committal. He was tired of the whole pattern. The final straw was probably when I suggested we go to this food truck festival thing downtown that I'd heard about. Derek said sure, that sounded fun and like a nice way to spend an afternoon. But then when he asked if I wanted to make a whole day of it, maybe grab breakfast first and walk around the neighborhood afterward to see what else was going on, I got all weird and uncomfortable about it. I started talking about how I had errands to run and couldn't commit to spending the entire day together like that. Like, who does that? Who suggests a date with someone and then immediately starts putting limitations on how much time they're willing to spend with you? That's when Derek knew for certain that he was done pretending this was ever going to turn into something real and substantial. You don't have to be a genius to figure out that someone who treats spending an entire Saturday with you like some kind of major life commitment is not someone who's looking for a serious relationship. And Derek was tired of being the only one who seemed to want more than just casual hookups and surface-level conversation that never went anywhere meaningful. So Derek told me straight up that he wasn't interested in continuing whatever it was we'd been doing for the past 6 months. No beating around the bush, no long explanation about his feelings or how I'd hurt him, and no dramatic nonsense or emotional manipulation. Just a simple, direct statement. This isn't working for me anymore, and I'm done. Of course, I immediately went into full damage control mode. I started asking what was wrong, what had happened between us, and whether we could talk about it and work things out. That's when Derek laid it all out for me, because he said I deserved to know exactly why he was walking away from whatever we had together. He told me he'd been waiting 6 months for me to show some genuine interest in building something real with him, something that had actual potential for a future. And instead of that happening naturally over time, I'd just gotten better and more sophisticated at keeping him at arm's length while making him think there might be more to our connection than there actually was. "Look, Maya," he said, "you've been stringing me along this whole time, and I'm not interested in being strung along anymore. You want to keep things casual and non-committal? That's fine. That's your choice and you're right. But find someone else to do it with because I'm not that guy. I'm looking for someone who actually wants to be with me, not someone who treats me like a backup plan or a way to pass time until something better comes along." I tried to argue with him, telling him he was being unfair and that he didn't understand my situation. I said I just needed more time to figure things out and that we could work something out together if he would just be patient with me for a little while longer. But Derek had already made up his mind completely. He explained that my actions over the past 6 months had already told him everything he needed to know about how I felt and what I actually wanted from him. This conversation wasn't going to change any of those fundamental issues between us. "No," he said firmly. "We're not working anything out, and this isn't a negotiation. I hope you find what you're looking for, Maya, but it's not going to be with me." And then Derek hung up the phone, blocked my number, and deleted me from all his social media accounts. The whole thing was done and final. "Because once you make a decision like that," he said later, "you stick with it completely. You don't leave the door open for someone to keep wasting your time with false hopes and empty promises." When Derek hung up on me that night, I sat there staring at my phone for like 10 minutes straight, thinking he'd call back within a few minutes. Because guys don't just end things like that, right? They get mad. They storm off dramatically. They give you the silent treatment for a few days to make you worry. But then they come back, wanting to talk it out and work through whatever the problem is. That's how these situations usually go, at least in my experience with breakups and relationship drama. But by Thursday, when I still hadn't heard anything from him at all, I started to panic a little bit. I texted him something casual and non-threatening. Just, "Hey, hope you're having a good week." Nothing dramatic or relationship-focused that might scare him off. Derek didn't respond to that message at all. So I waited another day and tried calling him directly, thinking maybe he just wasn't in a texting mood. But when I called, it went straight to voicemail without even ringing, which was weird. And when I tried to check his Instagram profile to see if he'd posted anything recently, I couldn't find his profile anymore. That's when it finally hit me that he'd actually blocked me everywhere. My phone number, Instagram, probably Facebook too. Like I was some crazy ex-girlfriend who'd been stalking him or causing drama in his life. The worst part about the whole situation was how completely normal everything else in my life felt while I was falling apart inside over this guy. I still had to go to work every single day and coordinate surgical schedules, deal with doctors throwing tantrums about room assignments, and handle all the usual chaos that comes with working in a medical center. But I kept catching myself checking my phone every 5 minutes, hoping against hope that Derek had changed his mind and decided to reach out. I'd be in the middle of updating patient charts or reviewing surgery schedules, and suddenly, I'd remember something funny he'd said during one of our dates, or the way he'd laugh at my work stories. Or I'd see a guy with dark hair walking down the hallway at the medical center, and my heart would do this stupid little jump thinking it might actually be him, even though Derek had no reason to be at my workplace. After 2 weeks of complete radio silence from him, I did something I've honestly never done before in my entire dating history. I showed up at that coffee shop near his work where we'd met for lunch a couple of times during our relationship. I told myself I was just getting coffee and it was a coincidence, but obviously I was hoping I'd run into him and we could talk things through like adults. And I did see him there. Derek was walking out of the coffee shop just as I was walking in, and for a split second I thought maybe this was some kind of sign from the universe or whatever. Maybe we were meant to run into each other and have a chance to talk through what had happened between us. But when Derek saw me standing there, his face just went completely neutral and blank, like I was a stranger or someone he barely remembered meeting once at a party years ago. He nodded politely and said Maya in the same tone you'd use to acknowledge someone you used to work with 5 years ago, completely devoid of any emotion or personal connection. And then, he just kept walking past me like nothing had ever happened between us. He didn't stop. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't seem angry or hurt or even annoyed to see me. It was just nothing. That's when I realized exactly how badly I'd screwed this whole thing up. Because that look wasn't anger or hurt or even irritation. Emotions that would have at least indicated he still cared enough to have some kind of feelings about me. It was just complete indifference. Like I'd become totally irrelevant to him in the span of just a few weeks. And honestly, that was so much worse than if he'd yelled at me or told me he hated me or gotten visibly upset, because at least those reactions would have meant he still cared enough to have strong feelings about our relationship ending. I tried reaching out to Tyler and Brandon again, thinking maybe I could pick up where I'd left off with one of them and get back into my normal dating routine. But it turned out that Tyler had started dating someone else seriously while I'd been focused on Derek and ignoring everyone else. And Brandon seemed pretty lukewarm and uninterested when I finally suggested we should meet up for drinks or dinner. It turns out that when you go weeks without responding to someone's messages or showing any real interest in spending time with them, they tend to move on and find other people to date. Which I guess makes perfect logical sense when you think about it, but it still felt like another slap in the face during an already difficult time. My work performance started suffering too, not in any major or noticeable way, but enough that my supervisor mentioned I seemed distracted and unfocused lately. I made a scheduling error that resulted in 2 different surgeries being booked in the same operating room at the exact same time, which is exactly the kind of mistake I never make because attention to detail is literally what I'm paid for. But I kept thinking about Derek constantly and wondering what he was doing with his time, whether he was dating someone new already, and if he ever thought about me at all anymore. The really pathetic part is that I started going to places where I thought I might see Derek again. I'd stop by the grocery store near his apartment complex, even though it was completely out of my way and more expensive than my usual place. I went to that sports bar where he'd mentioned watching games with his friends a few times, sitting there nursing a drink and pretending to be interested in whatever was on TV while secretly scanning the room for his face. I want to be clear. It wasn't full-on stalking exactly, but it definitely wasn't normal behavior either. I was hoping for another chance encounter where we might end up talking, and I could somehow explain myself, or apologize, or figure out a way to fix what I'd broken between us. But I never saw him anywhere, which somehow made the whole situation feel even worse. It reminded me of how little I actually knew about Derek's real life outside of our once-a-week dates. I'd spent 6 months with this guy, but couldn't even predict where he might be on a random Tuesday evening. That realization hit me hard. I'd kept him at such a distance that I'd never really gotten to know him as a complete person with a full life. It's been 4 months now since Derek ended things between us, and I'm still completely single. I've been on a few dates through the dating apps, met some guys who seemed decent enough on paper, but nobody measures up to what I had with Derek. Which is incredibly ironic since I spent 6 months taking that connection for granted and treating it like it wasn't anything special. I keep thinking about how Derek said I'd been stringing him along, and even though I wanted to argue with him at the time and defend my actions, I can see now that he was absolutely right about everything. I was keeping him just interested enough to stick around and keep investing his time and energy in me, while making sure I never had to actually commit to anything real or meaningful with him. The thing is, I genuinely thought I was being smart about the whole situation. I thought I was protecting myself emotionally and keeping my options open in case something better came along. But all I really did was protect myself right out of the best thing I'd had in years. And now I'm sitting here exactly where I was afraid of ending up in the first place, completely alone. Except this time, it's not because some guy broke my heart or treated me badly. It's because I chose this outcome through my own actions and decisions, and that makes it so much harder to deal with.